All right, good morning. Sorry we're starting a little bit late. We have a full agenda, so my apologies for that. I'm Felicia Marcus, Chair of the Board. Today's Wednesday, July 8th at 9:10 a.m., and the workshop is called to order. With me are, to my left, Vice Chair Fran Spivey-Weber, to her left, Board Member Didi Diadamo, to my right, Board Member Tam Dodak, and to her right, Board Member Steve Moore. I don't know which of you to turn to. Will you guys just introduce the staff that are assisting us? I mean, I could introduce you too, I suppose.
Executive Director Tom Howard is out of the office for the next few days, and so assisting us today on my left is Chief Counsel Michael Laufer. On my right is Chief Deputy Karen Turkovich. I am Chief Deputy Director Jonathan Bishop, and assisting the board today is Janine Townsend and Courtney Tyner.
For those of you who aren't familiar, in this building, we have emergency evacuation rules. Just look for the exit. If you hear an emergency sound, pick up your stuff, take your friends, and proceed cautiously out of the building. We gather near 10th and J. If you want to wait with us, then you'll know when the all clear comes, and you can come back with us as we resume. Other thing is, I haven't done this. I have to do this. If you have cell phones, please set them on stun or turn them off so they don't make noise. And then the workshop is being webcast and recorded. So when you come up to the microphone, it's important to get close enough to it to be heard by the people in the room, and more importantly, over the webcast. We may hear you in your natural voice, but the key thing is that what I assume are hundreds of people listening on the webcast are able to hear you as well. And with that, we are resuming from yesterday first, in case any of the board members wish to make board member reports. If there are any highlights that you want to share before we move into the workshop. None? I just want to flag one thing, since I can't talk to Tam and Fran except out in front. On the LA groundwater cleanup speed up work that you all are spearheading, I went to a sister meeting that neither of you could join me at, since there can be only two. And I just wanted to let you know it was really good. And we had a lot of, an interesting thing in terms of just having a lot of the water agencies in the LA area sitting there with EPA, DTSC, and we have a new DTSC head of cleanup, so it was good to introduce her as well to this group, major water replenishment district, Long Beach, LA, a host of people there, as well as some folks from the private sector sharing ideas on how we could speed up the cleanup, but also talking about the GRIP program, which is a new program with WRD to try and work with some of the disadvantaged communities and the like. And I'll just see that Jonathan came with me, and Deb Smith was there, and we'll figure out how to loop you in, since I can't tell you. But it was very encouraging, and we have a few short-term action items that they're teeing up for us where we can actually be helpful, not in our regulatory capacity necessarily, although that's there too, but just in showing up on certain things. So it's very exciting, and a lot of interest in furthering the use of recycled water, stormwater capture, and the like. It was really great. Okay, great. We are now moving on to item 10, which is a workshop on conservation rates and pricing. Obviously, this is a challenging period of time, not just because of the drought, but because of trying to figure out how to come up with pricing systems that allow our utilities, our water agencies, to continue to do the fine work they do and provide the service that they do in a challenging world. And so we know that an effective price signal is one of the best ways to achieve water conservation, both through this drought and really resilience to future droughts. So today we're going to hear from experts in economics and law and policy on how we can make rates and pricing an effective part of our short-term and our long-term strategy for water conservation. Conservation is not only critical for managing through the current drought, it's the #1 priority in the Governor's Water Action Plan, conservation as a California way of life. We also were directed in the April 1st executive order from the governor to help local agencies with rates and pricings. We understand rates and pricing. We understand this is a challenging time and a challenging world. And I look forward to this being really a community conversation about how we move forward in the most effective, efficient, supportable, and I think a transparent way in working with, having been someone who has had to raise rates and set rates at an agency, I understand how challenging it can be and how much more challenging it is today than when I was doing it. And we want to figure out how to be of most help to all of you. But really, in looking at the very fine comments that people submitted, I just want to thank so many of you for stepping up with suggestions, not just concerns and critiques, but also suggestions as we figure out how to support each other and do this in a way that's the most thoughtful way possible. We're going to start with 3 panels before we move to public comment. Each of those panels will be moderated by one of our staff. Our first panel will be moderated by Max Gomberg, our Climate and Water Conservation Program Manager. Our second panel is going to be moderated by Darren Polimas, the Director of our Financial Assistance Division. And our third panel will be moderated by Michael Laufer, our Chief Counsel. So looking forward to an instructive and productive discussion. We'll all be smarter than we were when we walked in, I hope, at the end of the day. We certainly won't be done, but I think it'll elevate and set a foundation for the next set of conversations that we need to have to figure out how we move forward. So with that, anything else you need, Max, before we start, or should I just turn it over to you?
That's great. We're actually, before we go to the panels, we're going to start with a brief staff presentation, which I'm going to give, which I think we'll load up there in a minute. Great. So, good morning, audience. We're just going to go through some very high-level elements of what we hope to hear about and issues that need to be discussed as part of this workshop and ongoing work on rates and pricing, as Chair Marcus mentioned, and then we're going to move pretty quickly into the panels. So, as Chair Marcus mentioned, in the Governor's April 1st, 2015 Executive Order, Directive Number 8, sort of tells the Water Board to do a number of things, and you can see them listed up there. What I want to stress about this is, the state is not rushing out to sort of supplant local decision-making and local authority here. We do have direction through this executive order to take a more active role at the state level, but how we do that and what the particulars are is exactly what we want to hear from you all today. And of course, the board is not the only actor here at the state level. The legislature may have a role, other agencies, our Department of Water Resources, our energy regulatory agencies, our Public Utilities Commission, our Energy Commission may also have a role to play. So this is by no means an exhaustive list, and I would be remiss to not start with mentioning Article 10, Section 2 of our state constitution, which just talks about making sure that there's not waste and unreasonable use of water in general in the state. But I wanted to highlight the 3 different pieces of legislation that you see up here briefly because I think they're really relevant to the issues that we're going to be grappling with over the summer and beyond. So the first is the Human Right to Water Bill, which was passed in 2012. The Human Right to Water Bill, one of the requirements for all state agencies, but particularly for the board and for the Department of Water Resources, is this duty to consider affordability in all actions. So any action that the board would take would really need to build that affordability component into whatever the strategy is, whether it's funding, technical assistance, regulatory, et cetera. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that from our panelists. The second is allocation-based rates, and I know that there are members of the audience today who work at agencies that have adopted these rate structures. The legislature put in language sort of signaling that these may be an effective way to achieve conservation and other goals, and I know they're increasing in popularity. And we've recognized that in prior iterations of the board's emergency regulations, we created a special category for agencies with allocation-based rate structures. And then thirdly, there are requirements in the urban water management plans, which are required by all 411 larger water supply agencies in the state. They're all required to have this thing called a water shortage contingency plan, which is essentially a plan for shortages, whether caused by drought or other types of emergencies. And within the requirements for those plans are requirements that agencies describe what types of penalties and charges for excessive use they might be using, what the impacts of a drought or other emergency would have on their revenues, and what measures they would take to mitigate that. I'll note that these plans are issued once every 5 years, and the level of detail in them varies widely. We know that conservation is effective. Price signals are effective. There's a long body of literature and economic study on this. We know that they're particularly effective when they are accompanied with good public outreach and people understand what's being asked. And we have good experience to draw on from what's been done in the electric sector as well. The reason for including that long list of citations below is just to point out that some of the people who have authored those papers are in the room and will be on panels later today. So at the top, Ken Barenclough from UC Riverside will be on our second panel. Heather Cooley from the Pacific Institute will also be on our second panel. Ellen Hannick from the Public Policy Institute of California will be on our opening panel. And Gene Clinton from the Public Utilities Commission, who has a lot of experience in the electric side of this, is also here and will be on our opening panel. Briefly, there are lots of ways to design rates to achieve conservation outcomes. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but sort of some of the main types. That top bullet is the one that is most commonly used. Essentially, as you use more, you pay more, and it's not a linear fashion, right? It generally bumps up at some level of use. Those are called blocks or tiers. We already covered allocation-based rates, which basically give customers, residential customers, a specific allocation, and then have charges for exceeding that allocation. There are seasonal rates that increase the price during the summer when it's more expensive to pump water. There is a model that was inaugurated, later rescinded, in the city of Davis a couple of years ago that sort of differentiates the price that people pay based on the size of the meter, which is generally a fixed charge in most places, so it creates a little more of an incentive. And then in the energy sector, we have even more complex rate making. So a couple of the different rates are listed there, time of use, so that you pay more in the afternoon during certain hours when it's more expensive to produce energy. And then even more, on certain days when it's the hottest day of the year during the summer and the grid is stressed. So there are a lot of different ways to structure a rate to send that price signal. But rates are not the only topic here. There are also lots of other different pricing mechanisms that can be used to achieve conservation outcomes. And again, these are just a few of the pricing mechanisms that are out there and available and used. So on connection fees, right, this is for new developments. Almost all water agencies charge them, but what level they're set at and other factors vary widely. Some agencies use connection fees as a way to fund basically additional conservation to offset the impact of the increase in demand from the development. There are lots of different ways to fund low-income rate assistance, and I know that Ms. Clinton will talk about some of that. There are also, special types of programs, charges. So for in the energy side, we have conservation and efficiency, technology development, along with renewables that are funded through various public purpose programs, public goods charge, procurement funds, and the like. And then we have some new models that have been brought to bear in the last decade or so, financing models. One's listed there, the Sonoma County model, which basically allows for financing or paying for water efficiency improvements such as shower heads, low flow toilets and the like, and paying that back on the water bill over a period of time.
Can I ask a question? Are we going to talk about that more in one of the panels?
Yeah, I expect that multiple panelists will probably touch on that.
No, I'm particularly interested in it. There are some areas that have been able, for example, to put up hundreds of millions in rebates, but not every area can do that. So these kinds of programs seem particularly important given the public demand to allow them to be able to do this, similar to the PACE program and others in the energy side.
They're well suited to agencies that have a sort of capital fund that can really get things going and be there as a backstop if things don't work out. We don't collect much data about how rates and pricing are done at the state level. There are certain entities that do collect some data. So the top, we do, the Department of Water Resources does collect urban water management plans, but only once every 5 years. And there's no way to go and look at, across all these agencies, who's got what type of rate structure easily. You have to sort of dig into each plan, and they're often hundreds of pages. The Urban Water Conservation Council, for its members, does require annual reporting on rates. Not everyone's a member, and it's a voluntary association. And then the American Water Works Association does a survey once every other year on rates. And that survey usually gets about a 50% response rate. So you have about 200 of our 400 water utilities that respond to that and provide information about their types of rate structures and charges. One area that's often an area of confusion for customers is rates versus what actually goes on the water bill, and just wanted to highlight briefly that there are a lot of things that often appear on a water bill, and some of them are listed there. What generally gets focused on, though, is the variable rate, what you actually pay for the water you use, the volume, and so that's often where a lot of the focus is, as opposed to the other more fixed charges that go onto a bill.
Do all, I'm sorry, I know we'll get to this probably in others, but one of the issues, for some reason it's not a new issue, but that has come up in conversation more, is the fact that water bills frequently charged by unit, and a unit is 742 gallons. It's 100 cubic feet of water, so it makes sense to an engineer, but it certainly doesn't make sense to a regular person. Do some people do bills that actually say it in gallons so you could actually understand how much water you're using?
Some do, and I'll take this opportunity to note that we got a lot of really good comment letters on this item, and I thought with creative ideas, and one of the ideas, kudos to the city of San Diego, was to basically set that standard, to stop showing water usage in 100 cubic feet and just say, everyone should be able to see what their usage is in gallons, which I think is worthy of discussion. And just again, the note at the bottom, right, that just because the rate goes up doesn't necessarily mean what's on the bill goes up. Often rates get raised for higher use classes, and if the people who are using a small amount of water, even if the rate goes up, they may not see a bill increase. Right. So we know, and we've heard, particularly as the board has been instituting the emergency regulations, that some agencies are going to be faced with significant revenue losses. We had an independent firm do an economic analysis of our emergency regulation and found that revenue losses might be in the vicinity of $500 to $600 million across the state due to the emergency regulation. And there's been a lot of work on this. The Alliance for Water Efficiency, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, has done work on, really how the fact that sales are tied to revenues is really a deterrent to more ambitious conservation programs and ways to address that, which we will hear about also on the panels today. On the second bullet, I liken this challenge to the sort of broader challenge we have with the state budget in general. We have a progressive tax structure. We get a lot of our money from income tax, and when things go bad and that drops, we have that variable revenue stream to the state, and one of the ways that's being addressed now is through some type of fund, a reserve fund essentially. Water utilities often also address the potential for revenue shortfalls due to drought or other types of emergencies, economic downturns, through having some type of rate stabilization fund. But how much money goes in there, how it's managed, really determines the impact to customers when there is a prolonged drought and costs remain the same, and revenues drop. And then lastly, one aspect of rate setting is sales forecasting, is sort of trying to assess how much demand there will be. Again, hearkening back to work that the Alliance for Water Efficiency has done, they found just around the country in general that there's often a lack of attention to codes and standards that have gradually over time increased efficiency of appliances, and California's been a leader in that area, and also just lack of accounting for just overall changes in behavior, and so that leads to an overestimate of how much water is actually going to be sold and can skew planning.
And I would add, so much of the sales forecasting is based on population, and what you choose to use is based on whether or not you focus on density, or whether you have a more people living in larger plots. Can skew that number. And if you go for the high number that is provided to you from the county or whomever, versus a lower number, can also skew it. So figuring out what the recommended population number is and why is very important.
Absolutely, and we have Joe Grindstaff from the Inland Empire Utilities Agency with us today on the first panel, and their agency actually has firsthand experience with this, which I suspect he'll speak to. So these are the questions that just to keep in mind as we go through the panels. I think questions 1 and 2 are really relevant to the first 2 panels, and question 3 is most relevant to our third panel, our legal panel in the afternoon. But this is a big topic with a lot of different moving parts, and you could spend multiple workshops just on that top question, but we're going to try to dive in. We've got excellent panelists, and I think we'll have a good discussion. And as I mentioned, we've received some really great written comments from a number of academics, water agencies, NGOs, and others on all aspects of this topic, with some great suggestions. That City of San Diego suggestion was one of many. So I encourage everyone to read the comments that were submitted, and we'll definitely be reflecting on those today and beyond. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite our first panel to come up. I'm also going to do just a brief show and tell. This is the the M1 manual. This is the American Water Works Association rate setting manual. It's probably about, 4 pounds or so. There's a lot in it, and that's really shows how complex of a topic this is. But the folks who are coming up now really know how to tackle it. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to moderate this panel. I'm going to switch to a handheld mic and stand so I can see the audience. And I'm going to ask a couple of opening questions for the panel, and they're going to each give sort of opening statements, and then we'll sort of turn it over for a discussion.
All right, I have a very pedestrian question to ask. Do you guys have microphones in front of you? They're just, okay, good. Just making sure.
I think they're all good. Briefly, to my right, in order here, I'm not going to give long introductions because these people are all, have really impressive resumes and are, I think, known to you all. So to my right is Lester Snow, Director of the California Water Foundation, past Secretary of our state's Natural Resources Agency. To his right, Joe Grindstaff, the head of the Inland Empire Utilities Agency with over 3 decades of experience at the state and local level in water management. To his right, we have Ellen Hannick from the Public Policy Institute of California, who now directs their water center, an expert on water policy and economics over a long period of time. And to her right, Jean Clinton, who is the Governor's Special Advisor for Energy Efficiency at the Public Utilities Commission, and knows everything related to the energy side of efficiency. Maybe I'll just start with Lester, if that's all right with you.
Good morning. I was actually counting on Joe and Ellen going first on the agenda, so I could just say, yeah, that's really good. But a couple of thoughts. The first thing I want to do is I want to bring this conversation back into the broader context, which is about reinvestment in a resilient water system. I mean, that's why we're struggling with rates and talking about this. The drought is bad, but what is worse is it's revealed really fundamental weaknesses in our water management system. And it's time to aggressively invest in diversification of our infrastructure, stormwater recycling, groundwater recharge, habitat restoration, and invest in conservation and efficiency. And we do that episodically, especially when we pass a bond. And some local agencies do it better than others, but it really is about investing in climate adaptation. And we talk about it, and we're not doing as good a job as we talk on that. The price of water should reflect the cost of these investments. I feel very strongly about that. So I'll just hit a couple things very quickly. One, and Max mentioned this, the Alliance for Water Efficiency put out a publication that we participated with the Walton Family Foundation and Water Research Foundation in funding that, because we thought it was important to have some sort of framework for people to work with. Max also brought up, actually the chair brought up the issue of getting customers better information. We funded a demonstration project, but with WaterSmart software in East Bay Municipal Utility District, of moving from those units of water to actually giving customers information in per capita rate and then comparing it to the neighborhood and others. And then when they're high, whether it's indoor, outdoor, giving them specific tips on what they can do. And that resulted, we had a third-party evaluation, so we didn't trust it to WaterSmart software or East Bay Mud. We had third-party reviewers came in and basically confirmed slightly over a 5% reduction just by giving them that kind of different information. So on to just a couple real specifics on this topic. We need to reform Prop 218. Prop 218 is an obstacle to some of these conservation techniques, certainly to lifeline rates. It is a hindrance to what I would call aggressive tiered pricing. And I think it's kind of a bad situation where we're pushing people to conserve, and we have systematically withheld some of the tools. Joe probably has a sharper perspective on that issue. And the other issue, and the final one I'm going to bring up, is just a water fee. I feel very strongly that we need to have a water fee. Perhaps it is called the Drought Recovery and Preparedness Fund, and it's something that provides that stable stream of revenue to invest in the things to deal with climate change, to invest in things that I presume Ellen will talk about in terms of orphaned projects that nobody's funding, that fall between the cracks, and also help to catalyze further regional resilience and secure that kind of stable investment. Water is a high priority right now. We have a tenfold increase in the level of attention in California. We wait till things get back to some false normal and we won't have this attention. So it's a year like this that we need to move and make fundamental policy change. Thank you.
On that point, Mr. Snow, I'm just reminded of a discussion we had yesterday about our transition to having the drinking water program and about this type of water fee structure. The Prop 1 and other bonds will help us with capital investments, but it was very clear with this discussion we had yesterday that operation and maintenance costs of all this capital work can't be, we can't tap into bond funding for that. Would a water fee assist with that type of unfunded?
I believe it would have to provide that kind of O&M. That's something I've learned from the environmental justice community, is while there may not be enough capital, it's easier to get the capital than it is to get the operating money. And it's a crime, the number of people in this state that don't have adequate drinking water, and we have to address that issue.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll go ahead and follow Lester. I kind of would have preferred to be before him because he's always a hard act to follow. I'm going to suggest a couple of things that I think, I agree with everything he said. I want to suggest a couple of things that I think would build on where we're at. I think by and large, and I have some facts, but I'll have more facts to back it up in the next few weeks, if we actually today met the standards that are currently in law, that we have already a model landscape ordinance, if we actually lived within the confines of that at 0.8 times the evapotranspiration rate, and we actually lived within the number that's estimated for indoor daily use, which is 55 gallons per day, that we'd actually, probably most agencies would already meet the targets that the governor has set. And so one of the things that I think you guys could consider doing is actually assigning a penalty that the board would collect from agencies for entities, parties that go over those state standards. So, and I'm partly suggesting this. Max in our pre-call said, suggest wild things. Don't be afraid to. So this one I know my colleagues in the water community would hate. But in some ways, I think you have the authority now to say this is waste and unreasonable use if it goes over the state standards. And I think you have the ability to assess a fee or a penalty for people that do that. And you could say to local agencies, for every month that somebody goes over this standard, you guys have to identify what it is, and you're assessed this penalty, and therefore you have the right to collect it from those parties. That deals with the challenge with 218 at the moment, may provide some revenue and may actually help give a signal to people, oh, there is a real state standard, and the state board is interested in enforcing that standard on everyone in California. And the truth is, you can have a really nice lawn, a really nice life living within those standards. In our area, people already use less than 55 gallons per day indoors. And if you go to new developments, we did a study about a year ago, new developments are typically using 37.5 gallons per day indoors. With conservation, we're probably now close to 50 gallons per person per day on indoor use. And it's certainly possible if you meet the standard of 0.8 times the evapotranspiration rate, I know it's a technical thing, to actually have a very nice, and including having lawn, it's actually very possible to have that. And it takes into account the climate of the local region. So I want to suggest that as one alternative. One of the other practical suggestions, I think, is that we have this system, the SEMA system of measuring evapotranspiration, measuring weather across the state. Right, and it was originally designed to help with agriculture. I think that system could be expanded so we'd actually have better information that could be used in urban areas. About 40% of it is no longer operative at the moment, as I understand it. But if we expanded that system and made that information available to people, I think that's something that might really be useful moving ahead.
And that's because it's expensive to do individually by agency?
Yeah, typically local agencies maintain the system, and after a few years, some don't feel like it's in their interest to continue doing that. They submit the data to DWR, who posts it for everyone. But if we could figure out some way of incentivizing people to do that, or coming up with funding to actually reinvigorate that program and expand it, I think we need more coverage in urban areas. So we have 850,000 people in our service area, and we don't have a SEMA station in our area. So I think it would be useful to have broader coverage and more information as we move ahead. I guess the last thing you're already covering with your third panel is really, really important to have legal stability for rates. We have a number of agencies that are interested in developing more conservation-based rate structures, but they're put off by the state of the law right now, not knowing where to go and not trusting, not wanting to change to a new system and then be told that that new system is not legal. So Lester's point about 218, I actually do believe that there should be a connection between cost and what you charge people. But there are times when, as I described, if people are using a lot more water than they need to use, that shouldn't be supported, and there should be some way of assessing a penalty and sending that price signal, because after all, that's the thing that we most often in our society respond to, so that people actually understand, oh, there's a limit here. And so I think that's important. And I'll be glad to answer other questions later on. If you want to talk about population forecasts and some of those things, I'd be glad to do it.
In the spirit of clarification, when you were talking about the weather stations and getting more of a broad system, that was really related to deriving performance standards?
It was. So if we're going to say you should live within the current state standard, the expectation that you use 80% of the evapotranspiration rate, it would be really useful to actually have a station that everybody can rely on, so you know in any given area what that evapotranspiration rate is.
Be a deployment of infrastructure to assist with more accurate performance standard setting.
Yes, and it does. The state itself doesn't have to build those right now. They aren't built by the state, but somehow the state has to coordinate and incentivize those to be built and then maintained. And building them's not the big deal, I don't think. It's really the ongoing maintenance, as Lester described with other issues. It's the ongoing costs. If you're going to have this and you're going to maintain it for 20 or 30 years, technology changes, what you have to do changes, and it's a long-term commitment.
And a clarification on your, was it wild, crazy recommendation? I mean, the governor championed, and there is now authority for water agencies to issue fines for, wasteful use of water. Is your suggestion that there be, in addition to this maximum threshold that is in law, a minimum mandatory fine that the board would then require be imposed and collected?
No, I hadn't thought about it that way, but that's one way of doing it. My thought was that somehow there be fines that are there, and that what I was thinking was actually that you impose a fine on water agencies that they then would pass along to their customers. You require them to report how many customers there are and how much water was used that went above this state standard, and that you $1 a thousand gallons or something like that. I don't know, but it could be the other way. It was just after Max said think about crazy things, I thought about this.
Because the water agencies already have the authority in law.
Sure
right
they
now.
do, but I don't know of any water agency that's actually doing something like that in the drought, and you have the ability to actually say, this is waste and unreasonable use if you go over this. And I think it's important that those kinds of standards be based on that real legal authority to say what waste and unreasonable use is. And I think it's important that waste and unreasonable use be tied to standards set either through regulation or in law passed by the legislature. Somehow, if we have those kinds of fundamentals in place, then it's easier for everybody to say, okay, I know what I have to live up to. And for water agencies, for all of the yelling and screaming that we do when we're not happy with things, we're really a pretty law-abiding folk. And we'll
Notice that.
And if we know this is the standard we're supposed to meet, we're supposed to help our customers meet it, and we're going to pay a fine if they don't meet it, we're going to find a way to pass that fine on to them, and we're going to find a way to try and really get them to meet that standard. And I don't think it's really hard, as you know, for a local elected official to say, I want to fine you for overwatering, and the way we know you overwatered is because your bill went up this month and you used 20 units and you should have only used 15, and we're going to, you can adopt it as part of the rate structure, but actually say it's a penalty. I think it's really helpful if it comes from the state board.
Thank you. Intriguing. We might have to send a protective detail home with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
No, it's interesting. I mean, waste and unreasonable use is a phrase that people toss around to apply to whatever they don't like. I've noticed this a lot in the last few months when the point you're getting to is it's a societal reasonableness, not what Felicia or Tam or Lester or Ellen or Joe think is reasonable at the moment. And so what you're saying, just so I understand it, is there are state rules and standards that you would tie it to. And we would have to then say it's unreasonable to go beyond these.
Absolutely.
Not just set by us, but set by the legislature. It still seems pretty complicated, but I see what you're saying.
It is fairly complicated, but we adopted a model landscape ordinance in the state in 2010, I think. And it's being updated now by DWR, and it sets standards for landscaping for urban areas. It doesn't deal with agriculture, and that's it's a difficult thing that you'd have to figure out there. But I think setting standards is an important thing. And it almost doesn't matter if there are fees. Sometimes just knowing this is a real standard and I'm going to be measured, people, all of the public agencies that are reporting to you on their monthly use, the per capita daily use, because it's measured, that's changed how people manage what they're doing. And so if we actually set a standard of reasonable use and we measure that, even without penalties, my prediction is that would cause changes in behavior, because everyone would say, oh, this is reasonable use as defined by the State Water Resources Control Board under state law. We need to really be careful about that.